The stagecoach hit the ford at full speed, and Pearl Wells knew before the front wheel struck the submerged rock that it was going to overturn. She had been riding the high bank above the Awahi crossing on her way back from the Dunbar place, her saddlebags still smelling of liniment and blood from a difficult calving, when she heard the gunshots. 3 riders in dusters and flour sack hoods had come out of the willows on the far side of the river, firing into the air and driving their horses straight at the coach team. The driver, a stocky man she recognized as Jed Turner, hauled hard on the reins, but the lead horses spooked sideways into the current, and the whole rig went over with a crack of splintering wood that she felt in her teeth. Pearl did not think. She put her heels into her mare and went down the bank at an angle no sane person would choose, gravel spraying from beneath the mare's hooves, because there was a woman screaming from inside the overturned coach, and the river was already pulling at the wreckage. She was not the only one who had heard the shots. Timothy Haskins came off the opposite ridge like something poured downhill, his big gray-black stallion, Duke, eating the distance in long, furious strides. Timothy had been leading 2 newly shod plow horses back to the Prout farm when the gunfire cracked across the valley, and he had dropped the lead ropes and given Duke his head without a second thought. He reached the water's edge only seconds behind Pearl, and for one strange, suspended moment their eyes met across the wreck of the coach, 2 people who had not spoken more than a handful of words to each other in nearly 10 years, both thinking the exact same thing. Get the horses cut free before they drown themselves. Pearl shouted, already sliding out of her saddle into water that came to her knees. I have got them, Timothy called back, and he was off Duke's back and into the river before the words had finished leaving his mouth, wading toward the panicked, screaming team still harnessed to the wrecked coach. The masked riders had not expected resistance. They had expected a driver, a handful of frightened passengers, and an easy grab. One of them wheeled his horse toward the strongbox lashed at the rear of the coach, but the other 2 hesitated at the sight of 2 more riders converging so fast, and that hesitation cost them. Pearl reached the coach door, which now faced the sky like the lid of a trunk, and wrenched it open against the pull of the current. Inside, tangled in skirts and spilled traveling cases, was an older man in a black coat, his face gray with pain, one arm bent wrong beneath him and pinned against his chest absurdly a strapped wooden ballot box with the seal of Baker County stamped in the lid. My arm, the man gasped. I believe it is broken. Miss, the box, please do not let them have the box. I am not worried about a box right now, Mr. Prout, Pearl said, recognizing him as the county election clerk. I am worried about you drowning. She braced her boots against the coach frame and hauled him up and out by his good arm, water soaking her to the waist, while behind her she heard Timothy's voice, low and steady, talking to the terrified horses even as gunfire cracked somewhere above the bank. Easy, easy now, I have got you. Timothy was cutting the traces with the belt knife he always carried for shoeing work, freeing the lead horse first, then working down the line as the animals thrashed in the current. One of the masked riders had circled back and fired a shot that went wide and struck the water, and it was that shot, that single wild shot, that caught Duke across the shoulder as the stallion reared to keep his footing on the loose rock. Duke screamed, a sound Pearl had heard from injured horses before and never once gotten used to, and went down hard on his front knees in the shallows. Duke. Timothy's voice cracked with something raw and immediate, and he abandoned the harness horses to go to his stallion. But the ambushers, seeing their advantage slipping and a rider from the county road already visible in the distance, gave up on the strongbox and wheeled their horses back into the willows, taking with them only the ballot box that Alonzo Prout had been carrying, snatched from the wreckage in the confusion by the 3rd rider while Pearl's attention had been on pulling the clerk free. They were gone within a minute, hoofbeats fading east, leaving behind an overturned coach, a badly shaken driver, a broken-armed clerk, and a horse bleeding into the river. Pearl was moving before she had fully decided to move. She left Alonzo Prout propped against a boulder, told Jed Turner to keep pressure on his own bleeding scalp and stay put, and waited to where Timothy knelt in the water beside his stallion, his hands already slick and red where he pressed them against the horse's shoulder. "Let me see," Pearl said. "He is bleeding too fast," Timothy said, and there was a rasp in his voice she remembered from years ago, from the day his mother's buggy horse had come home without her. "Pearl, I cannot lose this horse." It was the first time he had said her name in 10 years, and there was no room in either of them to notice that yet. "You are not going to," Pearl said, already pulling her satchel from her mare's saddle, the one she carried on every call because a horse doctor learned quickly that trouble did not wait for convenient moments. "Hold him still. Talk to him. He trusts your voice." The bullet had only grazed him, but it had torn a long furrow through muscle at the point of the shoulder, and Duke had cut himself further scrambling on the rocks, opening a second gash above the fetlock that was bleeding in a way Pearl did not like at all. She worked fast, the way her father had taught her, packing the wound, threading a curved needle by feel more than sight because her hands knew the motion even when her eyes were busy watching the horse's ears and eyes for the moment he might decide to bolt. "Talk to him," she said again. "Not to me, to him." Timothy pressed his forehead briefly to the stallion's neck and began speaking low and constant, the way she remembered he used to talk to every skittish colt his father brought into the forge for shoeing, that same patient rumble that had made even the wildest horses in the county stand quiet for him. Duke's ears flicked toward the sound and settled, and beneath her hands Pearl felt the great body ease from panic into something more like trust. "You are very good at that," she said, tying off the first stitch. "I had a good teacher," Timothy said. "You remember him. Old Ezra Cobb used to say a scared horse does not need a rope, it needs a reason to believe you are not going to hurt it." "I remember." Pearl did not look up from her work, but something in her chest had gone tight and warm at once, hearing him talk that way, watching his big scarred hand stay so gentle against the horse's neck. She had known this man since she was 7 years old and he was 9, since he used to walk her home from the schoolhouse in Journey's End, so the older Prout boys would not throw rocks at her braids. She had not expected, kneeling in a bloody river with a wounded stallion between them, to feel her pulse doing something it had absolutely no business doing. It took the better part of 20 minutes to close both wounds well enough to move him, and by the time Sheriff Abner Reese came pounding down the road with 2 deputies, alerted by a rider from the Prout farm, Duke was standing on his own 4 legs, trembling but alive, and Alonzo Prout was explaining through gritted teeth that the county ballot box from the Sagebrush precinct, 40 miles of hard-won votes counted by honest election judges, had just been stolen at gunpoint 2 weeks before the general county election was to be certified. Sheriff Reese took his hat off and looked at the river, and then at the empty road east, and swore in a way he immediately apologized to Pearl for. "That box has got the returns for near 60 voters in it," he said. "Whoever took it did not want money. Strongbox is still sitting right there under the coach, untouched. They wanted that box specific." Pearl straightened up, wiping her bloody hands on a rag from her satchel, and looked at Timothy Haskins across the back of his wounded horse. "Somebody is trying to steal this election," she said, "and they just about killed 4 people and a horse doing it." Timothy met her eyes, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with ballots or bandits, something that had been sitting quiet and unacknowledged for 10 years, and had just been shaken loose by a gunshot and a river. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "we had better find out who." Duke could not travel far that first night, so Pearl insisted he be brought to her ranch rather than back to Timothy's place on the far side of town, since her barn was closer and she wanted to watch the wounds herself for fever. Timothy did not argue. He walked the whole 4 miles beside his limping stallion rather than ask the animal to carry weight, and Pearl rode alongside at a slow walk, the 2 of them talking in fits and starts the way old friends do, when the years between them have to be carefully stepped around like loose stones in a creek bed. "Your father would have known what to do about that box," Timothy said, as the sun dropped low and orange over the sage flats. "Nathaniel Wells never met a problem he could not doctor. He would have ridden straight into Dunmore's office and called him a thief to his face," Pearl said, "and there was old grief in it, worn smooth like a stone handled too many times. Which is probably why he is not here to do it now, and I am the one who has to be careful instead." "You think it is Dunmore?" "I know it is Dunmore." Pearl's voice hardened. "Cyrus Dunmore has been trying to buy the crossing land out from under me since 3 months after my father's funeral. He wants to put a toll bridge over the Awahi, and my father's homestead sits on the only good ford for 20 miles. He needs the county commissioner's office to grant him the water rights and the bridge charter, and Judge Whitfield has told him twice he will not approve it while there is a free ford serving the wagon trade. So Dunmore is running his own man, Horace Bell, and Horace Bell cannot win Sagebrush Precinct honestly, because everybody out there rode with my father on the Awahi Ditch Company for 15 years, and they know exactly who Bell answers to. So he steals the box instead of buying the votes. Or he steals it, loses it, and claims a fire or an accident, and the whole precinct gets thrown out on a technicality," Pearl said. 60 votes gone, and Bell wins the county by 40. Timothy walked in silence for a moment, his hand resting light on Duke's neck. "My father used to shoe Dunmore's carriage horses," he said finally. "Man never once paid on time, always had some reason. I stopped taking his business 2 years ago, after he tried to talk me into shorting the iron on a wagon axle for the Prute Freight line so he could buy it cheap out of salvage. I would not do it, and he has not forgiven me for it since." Pearl looked over at him with new interest. "You never told anyone that?" "Nobody asked," Timothy said, with the faint, dry, almost smile she remembered from when they were children, the one that used to mean he was about to say something he thought was funnier than it actually was. "Besides, a blacksmith who cannot keep his customer's business quiet does not stay in business long. But I will tell you now, because it seems like the sort of week for it. Cyrus Dunmore is not a man who minds who gets hurt so long, as it is not him standing in the mud." They reached the Wells Ranch as the last light was fading into a deep gold over the western ridge, and Pearl's ranch hand, an old, sun-cracked man named Caleb Bishop who had worked the place since before Pearl was born, came out with a lantern already lit, having heard the news from a rider an hour ahead of them. "Lord above, Miss Pearl, they are saying road agents hit the Sagebrush stage." "They did, Cal, and I need the small stall bedded deep, and the lantern kept low so it does not spook him," Pearl said, already moving into motion, the tiredness of the day burned away by the simple, familiar comfort of having work to do. "Timothy, bring him in slow. I want to look at that shoulder wound again before I trust it to hold overnight." Timothy did as she asked, and if Caleb Bishop noticed the particular way Timothy Haskins watched Pearl Wells move around his stallion, competent and unhesitating in the lantern light, checking pulse and breath, and the color of the horse's gums with the same quiet authority her father had once carried, the old ranch hand was wise enough not to say a word about it, not yet. By the time Duke was settled, fed a mash of bran and warm water, and standing with his weight comfortably distributed on all 4 legs, it was full dark, and Pearl found herself standing in her own kitchen doorway with Timothy Haskins, both of them still damp and blood-stained, neither quite ready to say good night. "You should eat something before you ride back to town," Pearl said. "I have got beans on the stove and bread from this morning, and Cal will not mind if I feed a man who just about lost his horse and probably has not sat down all day." Timothy hesitated, and Pearl saw him hesitate, and something in her, something that had been quietly rearranging itself since the moment he had said her name in the river, decided she did not want him to say no. "I would be glad of it," he said. They sat at the scrubbed pine table in the lamplight, and for a while they simply ate, the silence comfortable in the way silence only is between people who once knew each other well enough that words were not always necessary. It was Timothy who finally spoke. "I used to think about you," he said, and then seemed almost surprised at himself for saying it. "After you went east to study. I used to wonder how a girl who cried for a week when her dog broke its leg ended up wanting to spend her life setting broken bones and stitching wounds for a living." Pearl laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, the first one that had come easy to her in days. "I cried because I could not fix it myself. That is the whole reason I went. My father could set a horse's leg with his eyes closed, and I could not do a single thing for my own dog but hold him and cry, and I decided right then I was never going to feel that helpless again. And now I have felt helpless plenty of times since," Pearl admitted. "But at least now I know what to do about it while I am feeling it." Timothy looked at her for a long moment, the lamp throwing gold light across the sharp, competent lines of her face and something in his chest, some door he had kept shut and bolted since his father died and left him alone with a forge and an empty house, creaked open just a little. "I am glad you came back," he said quietly. "I did not say it before now. I should have. Journey's End has not felt like much of anything since your father passed, and it felt a little more like itself again the day I heard you had come home to take over the ranch." Pearl felt heat climb up her throat that had nothing to do with the stove. "That is a kind thing to say to a woman covered in horse blood." "I have always found you easiest to talk to when you are covered in horse blood," Timothy said, and this time his almost smile went all the way to a real one, and Pearl thought, not for the first time that day, but for the first time she let herself actually think it clearly, that Timothy Haskins had grown into a very good-looking man, quiet and solid and steady in a way that made a woman feel like the ground under her was not going to shift. She did not act on the thought. Not yet. There was a stolen ballot box and a county election, and a man's stallion still recovering in her barn. And Pearl Wells had not built a working ranch out of her father's legacy by letting her feelings run ahead of her sense. But she banked the warmth of it like a coal for later. And when Timothy finally rode Duke slowly back toward town under a sky gone thick with stars, she stood on her porch and watched him go longer than she would have admitted to anyone. The next morning, Journey's End was buzzing like a kicked hive. News of the stagecoach ambush had traveled faster than any of the participants had, carried by the Prout boy on a fast horse before dawn. And by the time Pearl rode in to check on Alonzo Prout's broken arm and give her statement to Sheriff Reese, half the town had gathered outside the general store, arguing in low, worried clusters about road agents and stolen ballots, and what it meant for the election only 2 weeks off. Cyrus Dunmore stood on the porch of the store in a fine gray coat entirely too clean for a frontier town in July, flanked by 2 men Pearl did not recognize, and he was already talking, his voice carrying that particular oiled smoothness that made her back teeth ache. "A terrible business," he was saying to no one and everyone. "Terrible. I have said all along this county needs stronger law and a firmer hand, and here we have proof of it, right in the road, in broad daylight. I do hope Sheriff Reese will finally see the wisdom of Mr. Bell's platform on the matter." "Funny," Pearl said, dismounting and walking her mare straight up to the store porch without slowing, "that the only thing those road agents wanted was a ballot box full of votes for the Sagebrush precinct, which everybody here knows voted near 2-1 for Judge Whitfield in the last election. Strongbox with actual money in it, they left sitting right there in the mud." A ripple went through the small crowd. Dunmore's smile did not so much as flicker, but his eyes went flat and cold in a way Pearl had learned to recognize. "Miss Wells, I am relieved to hear you came through the incident unharmed. Terrifying business for a lady to involve herself in." "I did not involve myself, Mr. Dunmore. I pulled a man out of a wrecked coach and stitched up a bleeding horse. I would call that plain decency, not involvement. Though I notice you seem awfully informed about which box they wanted for a man who was not there." "Everyone in town is talking of nothing else," Dunmore said smoothly, It is hardly a secret which box was taken. No, Pearl agreed. It is not. What is a secret so far is who ordered it taken. She held his gaze a moment longer than was entirely comfortable, then turned and walked her mare on toward the sheriff's office, aware of the whispers starting up behind her, aware too of a familiar figure crossing the street from the direction of the forge, sleeves rolled to the elbow, soot still on his forearms from the morning's work. "You are making an enemy of a dangerous man in front of half the county," Timothy said, falling into step beside her, "and doing it rather well, I might add." "He was already my enemy," Pearl said. "I am just the first one willing to say so out loud. How is Duke this morning?" She asked because she found she genuinely wanted to know, and because the sight of Timothy's forearms, corded with muscle from a lifetime of hammer work, was doing something distracting to her train of thought that she did not have time for at the moment. "Sore, but eating well and standing steady on that shoulder," Timothy said. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay, Pearl." "You do not owe me anything. I would have done the same for any horse on the road agents or no." "I know that," Timothy said, and there was a directness in the way he said it that made her look at him. "That is not why I said it. I said it because it is true, and because I find I do not much want to let it go unsaid the way I let so many things go unsaid with you, once." Pearl's mare shifted under her, sensing the sudden stillness of her rider, and for a moment neither of them spoke, standing in the dusty street with the whole town still murmuring behind them about stolen ballots and road agents, while something far more private passed silently between the two of them. "We should talk to Sheriff Reese," Pearl said finally, a little unsteadily. "About the box." "We should," Timothy agreed, and neither of them moved for another 2 full seconds before they did. Sheriff Abner Reese's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the sheriff himself, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache and tired, honest eyes, looked like a man who had not slept. "I sent a wire to the county seat at first light," he said, once Pearl and Timothy had settled into the 2 chairs across from his desk. "Judge Whitfield is beside himself. Without that sagebrush box, the county clerk is saying the whole precinct's returns might have to be thrown out for lack of certified count, unless we can recover the box or find some other way to prove what was in it before the election is certified." "And if the box stays lost," Pearl said, "Horace Bell wins the county by a margin that would not exist if sagebrush had been counted." "That is about the size of it," Reese admitted. "You know it was Dunmore's men," Pearl said. "Everybody in that store this morning knew it, even if nobody but me had the nerve to say it plain." "Knowing and proving are 2 different creatures, Miss Wells, and you know that as well as I do," Reese said. "I cannot arrest a man for standing on a porch smiling. I need a rider I can identify, a horse I can trace, a man willing to talk. Right now I have 3 men in flour sack hoods and a getaway into the willows and nothing more." Timothy leaned forward. "The horses those riders were on. 2 of them were shod recent, within the last week, and shod poor, uneven nail spacing, the kind of work you get from somebody who does not do it often. I noticed it in the tracks along the bank this morning before the crowd trampled them flat. There are only 2 forges within 30 miles that would take on hasty work like that instead of turning a stranger away, mine and the one at the Dunmore stage relay station." Pearl looked at him with new respect. "You went back out to the crossing this morning." "Before sunup," Timothy said. "Seemed like the sort of thing that needed doing before the tracks were gone." Reese was already reaching for his hat. "Show me." They rode out together, the 3 of them, back to the crossing where the wreckage of the stagecoach still sat half submerged in the shallows, awaiting a work crew to haul it out. Along the eastern bank, in the softer mud beneath the willows where the ambushers had waited, Timothy crouched and pointed out what he had found that morning: hoofprints from 3 horses, one with a fresh shoe showing an uneven nail pattern on the outside branch, distinctive enough that Timothy said he would know it again anywhere. "That is Dunmore relay work," he said. "I would bet my forge on it. His hostler there is a fellow named Otis Kane, does rough, fast shoeing for the stage line, cuts corners something terrible, I have pulled his bad nails out of more than one lame horse." Sheriff Reese straightened up, mud on his knees, expression grim. "That is not proof enough to arrest Dunmore, but it is enough for me to go ask Otis Kane a few pointed questions, and enough for me to put a man watching that relay station." "Careful how you do it," Pearl said. "Dunmore is not stupid, whatever else he is. If he thinks the law is closing in, he will not just run. He will make sure that box disappears for good, burned or sunk, and any man who could testify to what he ordered done will disappear right along with it." She was, though none of them knew it yet, exactly right, and exactly 2 days too early with the warning. That night, after Pearl had ridden home in the long blue dusk and checked Duke's wounds one final time by lantern light, satisfied at the clean, healing edges of both cuts, she had just sat down to a late supper when Caleb Bishop came pounding up from the barn, his face white in the dark. "Miss Pearl, somebody is on the Ridge Road." Riders, 3 of them, moving slow, and they doused their lantern the second I stepped out to look. Pearl was on her feet and reaching for the shotgun that hung above the mantel before she had consciously decided to move. Her father had taught her to shoot before he had taught her to read, out of plain necessity for a girl growing up alone on isolated range, and her hands did not shake now as she broke the breech to check the load. "Get the horses into the barn and bar the door, Cal, and stay with them. If shooting starts, you get down and you stay down." She went out onto the porch with the shotgun cradled ready, her heart hammering but her hands steady, and watched 3 shapes detach themselves from the shadow of the ridge and come walking their horses down toward the ranch yard, unhurried, deliberately unhurried, in the way of men who wanted her to understand they were not afraid of being seen. "Miss Wells." The voice belonged to one of the 2 men she had seen flanking Dunmore that morning, a lean, hard-faced man with a low, unpleasant drawl. "Mr. Dunmore sends his regards and a friendly bit of advice. This ford of yours has caused a powerful amount of trouble for a powerful lot of folks who just want to see the county grow proper, with a real bridge instead of a mud crossing that floods every spring. Might be time to consider selling before something happens to make the land less appealing." "You get off my land," Pearl said, her voice flat and hard, the shotgun steady in her hands. "And you tell Cyrus Dunmore that a woman who just pulled a man out of a wrecked stagecoach and stitched a bullet wound closed with her own 2 hands is not a woman who scares easy." "Nobody said anything about scaring," the lean man said, with a smile Pearl did not like at all, and he raised his hand in a small, unhurried gesture, and a rifle shot cracked out from somewhere behind him and struck the water trough not 6 feet from where Pearl stood, sending splinters and water flying. Pearl did not flinch, though every muscle in her body screamed too. She raised the shotgun and fired into the air above their heads, a warning any man on the frontier understood instantly, and in the ringing silence after the blast she heard, from down the ridge road, the fast, hard drum of a horse coming at a dead gallop. Timothy Haskins came over the rise like a man riding out of a nightmare, Duke's healing shoulder be damned. A lantern he had apparently ridden 4 miles carrying now abandoned somewhere behind him. A heavy hammer, the closest thing to a weapon he had grabbed off the forge wall in his rush, held ready in one fist. "Get off her land," Timothy roared, and there was a fury in his voice Pearl had never heard from him before, not once in 20 years of knowing him. "Or I will pull every one of you off those horses myself." The lean man's smile faltered just slightly, calculating the odds of a furious blacksmith on a war-horse-sized stallion against a woman with a shotgun who had just proven she would use it, and apparently deciding the odds were not worth Dunmore's money. "No need for that," he said, backing his horse a step. "We were just leaving. Consider it a friendly warning, Miss Wells. Not everyone who comes calling next time will be so polite." They wheeled and rode off into the dark, and Pearl stood on her porch with the shotgun still raised, breathing hard, watching them go, until Timothy pulled Duke up in the yard and slid off his back so fast he nearly stumbled. "Pearl." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. "Pearl, are you hurt?" "I am fine," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, though now that the danger had passed her hands had begun to shake around the shotgun stock. "How did you even know to come?" "I did not," Timothy admitted. "I could not sleep. I kept thinking about what you said, about Dunmore not being stupid, about him closing in fast if he felt cornered. And I got it into my head that you were out here alone with only Cal for company, and I could not make myself stay in town another minute." Pearl looked up at him, at the fear and fury still written plain across his face, at the hammer still gripped white-knuckled in his fist, and something that had been building quietly for 2 days broke loose all at once. "You rode 4 miles in the dark on a wounded horse because you had a bad feeling," she said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "I would have ridden 40, Timothy said, and it was not a boast, it was simply the plain truth, said in the plain way he said everything, and Pearl felt something in her chest give way entirely. She set the shotgun down against the porch rail, and before either of them had quite decided what was happening, she had crossed the last few feet between them and put her arms around him, her face pressed against his shoulder, breathing in the smell of horse and wood smoke and honest sweat that she had somehow, without ever noticing it happen, come to think of as safety. Timothy's arms came around her slow, careful, as though she were something that might startle and bolt if he moved too fast, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the dark ranch yard, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining out of both of them and leaving something quieter and far more dangerous in its place. "I am sorry," Pearl said finally into his shoulder, not moving away. "I do not know what came over me." "Do not apologize," Timothy said, his voice rough. "I have been wanting to do this myself since I pulled you out of that river yesterday and could not think of a single sensible reason to." Pearl pulled back just far enough to look up at him, and in the pale wash of starlight she could see every line of his face, the same face she had known since childhood grown harder and stronger and, she admitted to herself now, entirely too handsome for her own peace of mind. "There is not a sensible reason now either," she said softly. "There is an election to save and a villain to catch and my whole ranch under threat. This is a terrible time for whatever this is." "Terrible," Timothy agreed, not moving away from her either. "Absolutely terrible timing." Neither of them stepped back. It was Caleb Bishop, emerging cautiously from the barn once the shooting had stopped, who broke the moment by calling out to ask if everyone was in one piece, and Pearl and Timothy separated with the slightly guilty haste of 2 people caught at something, though nothing more than an embrace had actually occurred. "Everyone is fine, Cal," Pearl called back, a little breathless. "Dunmore's men came to deliver a message. I sent them home with one of my own." They spent the rest of that night in the kitchen, the 3 of them, with the lamp turned up bright and the shotgun within reach, Timothy insisting on staying until dawn despite Pearl's token protests that he ought to go home and rest his own healing horse, and somewhere in the long hours of talking, of Pearl finally telling him the whole of how her father had died, a fever caught tending a sick herd during a hard winter, and Timothy telling her in turn how his own father's heart had simply stopped one evening at the forge, hammer still in his hand, the careful distance they had both been keeping for 10 years finally, quietly, entirely dissolved. They did not kiss that night. Pearl was not ready, not with Dunmore's threat still ringing in the yard, not with so much still unresolved, and Timothy, for all the want plain in his eyes, did not push. He simply stayed, a steady, solid presence at her kitchen table until the sky began to gray toward dawn, and when he finally rode home on a still limping but willing Duke, Pearl stood on her porch and watched him go, and found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like a very long week. The break in the case came 2 days later, and it came from an unlikely source. Timothy was closing up the forge for the evening, banking the coals and hanging his tools, when a shadow detached itself from the alley behind the smithy, and a low, nervous voice said his name. "Mr. Haskins." A word, if you would." Timothy turned, hammer still in hand out of old habit, and found himself looking at a thin, sallow young man he recognized as Silas Cobb, nephew to old Ezra Cobb, who had taught them both about horses years before, and more recently known around town as one of Dunmore's hired hands at the stage relay station. "Silas, you look like a man who has not slept." "I have not," Silas admitted, glancing back over his shoulder at the darkening street. "Mr. Haskins, I need your help, and I do not know who else to ask that I can trust not to run straight to Dunmore with it." "Go on." "I was one of the 3 men at the crossing," Silas said, the words coming out in a rush, as though he had been holding them in so long they hurt on the way out. "I did not fire on purpose at that horse, I swear it. My aim was bad and I am ashamed of it, but I was there, and I helped take the box. Dunmore paid us $20 apiece and told us it was just paper, that no real harm would come of it. I did not know until after that a man's arm got broke and a horse got shot. I have got a conscience, Mr. Haskins, whatever else folks might say of me, and it has been eating me alive." Timothy set the hammer down slowly. "Where is the box, Silas?" "That is the thing." Silas's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "Dunmore never meant to just lose it. He had me and Otis Kane switch the real ballots into a strongbox he keeps in his own office, replaced with blank paper folded to weight, and burned the empty box out behind the relay station so there would be ashes to show if anybody came asking. He means to hold those real ballots until after the election is certified without them, and then, if word ever gets out, claim they were recovered too late to matter. I have got the real box, Mr. Haskins. I took it out of his office 3 nights ago when nobody was watching, because I could not stomach being party to stealing an honest election on top of everything else. I have got it hidden, and I have got Dunmore's own ledger too, where he wrote out payments to me and Otis and Frank Delacourt in his own hand, plain as day, with dates that matched the ambush. Timothy's pulse was hammering now. "Silas, that is everything. That is enough to hang the man's whole scheme in front of a judge." "I know it," Silas said, "and it is also enough to get me killed if Dunmore finds out before I am somewhere he cannot reach me. I mean to take the evening train out of Huntington tomorrow, get myself to the county seat, and hand the whole of it over to Judge Whitfield and a federal marshal I know rides the circuit through there. But Dunmore has men watching every road out of Journey's End, and I am afraid to travel alone. Will you help me, Mr. Haskins? You and Miss Wells both, if she is willing. I would trust the 2 of you with my life, because it seems like that is exactly what I am asking you to do." Timothy did not hesitate. "I will fetch Pearl within the hour. We will get you and that box to Huntington if I have to fight every man Dunmore owns to do it." Pearl, when Timothy rode out to tell her, listened to the whole account with her jaw set hard and her eyes bright with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement but held elements of both. "Huntington is a full day's ride from here if we push," she said, already moving toward the barn to check her mare's shoes. "The evening train Silas means to catch leaves at 6 tomorrow. If we start before first light, we can make it with a few hours to spare, but only if nothing goes wrong on the road, and given the week we have had, I would not count on that." "I would not count on it either," Timothy agreed grimly. "But I would rather ride toward trouble with you beside me than sit here waiting for it to come find you again." Pearl looked at him for a long moment in the lantern light of the barn, at the steady, unshaken resolve in his face, and felt her heart do the same slow, warm turn it had been doing with increasing frequency for 3 days now. "All right, Timothy Haskins," she said softly. "Let us go save an election." They left before dawn the next morning, the 3 of them, Pearl, Timothy, and a pale, twitchy Silas Cobb with a battered leather satchel strapped across his chest containing Dunmore's ledger, and in a separate canvas sack lashed behind his saddle, the true ballot box from the sagebrush precinct. Duke, still favoring his shoulder slightly but sound enough for the journey, carried Timothy at an easy, ground-eating pace, and Pearl's mare kept stride beside him, while Silas rode a borrowed horse from the Wells ranch, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes as though he expected Dunmore's men to materialize out of the sagebrush at any moment. They very nearly did. It happened just after noon, on a stretch of the Huntington Road where the trail narrowed between a dry wash on one side and a rocky rise on the other, perfect ground for an ambush, and Pearl would think later, exactly the sort of ground Dunmore's men would have chosen if they had known which road to watch. They had known. Someone, perhaps a stable boy who had seen them leave, perhaps one of Dunmore's men keeping a wider watch than anyone had guessed, had gotten word out ahead of them, and 3 riders came down off the rocky rise with rifles already leveled, the same lean, hard-faced man from Pearl's ranch yard among them. "That is far enough," the lean man called out. "Silas Cobb, you're going to hand over whatever you are carrying, nice and slow, and then you are going to come back to Journey's End with us and explain yourself to Mr. Dunmore." Silas went white as flour, his hands trembling on the reins, but he did not stop his horse, and Pearl, thinking faster than she had time to be frightened, did the only thing she could think to do. She had spent her whole life reading the moods of animals, and she looked now not at the men but at their horses, tight-reined and nervous under riders who had pushed them hard and fast to get ahead of the group, and she reached for the one tool she knew better than any weapon. "Timothy," she said quietly, "when I say now, get low." She reached into her saddlebag, found the small tin horn she carried to call cattle in from distant pasture, a sharp, ear-splitting brass instrument her father had used for 30 years, and blew it as hard as she could, aimed directly at the 3 approaching horses. The blast, shockingly loud in the quiet canyon, sent all 3 animals into instant, screaming panic. Horses trained for riding, but pushed hard and hot in unfamiliar country, will bolt from sudden sharp sound faster than they will stand for gunfire they have heard before, and Pearl had gambled correctly. The lean man's horse reared and spun, throwing off his aim entirely as his rifle discharged harmlessly into the rocks, and his 2 companions fought for control of their own bucking mounts, one of them thrown clean off into the dust. "Now!" Pearl shouted, and the 3 of them broke into a dead run past the chaos, Duke surging ahead with Timothy low over his neck, Silas clinging white-knuckled to his saddle horn, Pearl bringing up the rear and blowing the horn once more for good measure as they thundered past the flailing, panicked ambushers and out onto the open flat beyond the canyon. They did not stop running for nearly 2 miles, until the horses were blowing hard and it was clear no pursuit was coming, the ambushers left far behind still fighting to recapture their spooked mounts. "That," Timothy said, when they finally slowed to a walk, breathless and grinning, despite himself in the particular way that comes after surviving something that should not have been survivable, "was the single cleverest thing I have ever seen anyone do with a cow horn. My father always said the animal usually solves the problem for you, if you understand it better than the man on its back does," Pearl said, though her hands, she noticed, would not quite stop shaking now that the danger had passed. "I did not expect to have to use it as a weapon of war." "Remind me never to make you angry," Silas said shakily, from where he had finally caught his breath, "if a tin horn can do that." They pushed on hard through the afternoon, nerves still singing, and reached the outskirts of Huntington as the sun was dropping toward the western hills. The little rail town spread out along the tracks with its water tower and freight yard, and the small, sturdy depot building where the evening eastbound train to Boise would be pulling in within the hour. It should have been the end of the danger. It was, instead, only the beginning of the most dangerous hour of the entire week. Cyrus Dunmore was waiting for them at the depot. He had not come himself, of course, being far too careful a man to be seen anywhere near actual violence, but he stood on the platform in his fine gray coat, flanked by 4 men rather than 2 this time, watching the road into town with a patience that told Pearl he had somehow guessed exactly where Silas Cobb meant to run, and had gotten there ahead of them by a faster, more direct route, while they had been fighting their way past his ambush in the canyon. The platform was crowded, farmers and freight agents, and a handful of travelers waiting for the same eastbound train, and Dunmore clearly intended to use that crowd, betting correctly that neither Pearl nor Timothy would want a shooting match in the middle of dozens of bystanders. "Miss Wells, Mr. Haskins," Dunmore called out pleasantly as they reined up at the edge of the platform, Silas nearly falling off his horse in his hurry to dismount, clutching the satchel to his chest like a lifeline. "And young Silas, I confess I am disappointed in you, son. I thought we had an understanding. You had my silence bought for $20, Mr. Dunmore," Silas said, though his voice shook badly, "and it turns out a man's conscience costs a good deal more than that." "How touching!" Dunmore's smile did not waver, but his eyes had gone to the canvas sack across Pearl's saddle, and to the satchel in Silas's white-knuckled grip, and something calculating and cold moved behind his gaze. "I think, given the circumstances, it would be best if you handed those items to my associates here, and we discuss this matter privately, away from all these good people who have a train to catch." "There is nothing to discuss," Pearl said, dismounting and stepping deliberately between Dunmore and Silas Cobb, her chin up, her voice carrying clear across the platform where a growing number of onlookers had begun to notice the tension in the standoff. "You stole a legal ballot box at gunpoint. You shot an innocent horse. You broke a man's arm, and you have spent the better part of a week trying to steal a county election out from under 60 honest voters. That train is going to leave with Silas Cobb and every scrap of evidence against you aboard it, or it is going to leave with a great many witnesses on this platform having watched you try to stop it. And I do not think, Mr. Dunmore, that even you can charm your way out of that in front of this many people." A murmur went through the crowd. Dunmore's smooth composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "Miss Wells, you are making a serious accusation with no proof at all." "The proof," Timothy said, dismounting to stand beside Pearl, his voice hard and carrying, "is right here in this satchel, in your own handwriting, Mr. Dunmore. Payments to Silas Cobb, to Otis Kane, to a man named Frank Delacourt, dated the very day of the ambush, alongside a ledger entry noting the removal of a ballot box you claimed was lost to fire. I have shod your horses for 2 years, and I know your hand from your bill book. I expect Judge Whitfield's clerks will know it just as well." Dunmore's men shifted, hands drifting toward holsters, but the crowded platform worked against them exactly as Pearl had gambled it would. A dozen strangers were watching now, farmers and travelers who had no stake in the county election, but a great deal of interest in not being caught in gunfire. And one of them, a stout woman with a market basket, had already begun calling loudly for someone to fetch the town marshal. It was in that moment of hesitation, with Dunmore's men uncertain and the crowd's attention a shield around them, that the eastbound train came around the bend in a great shriek of steam and iron, right on schedule, and the platform erupted into the ordinary chaos of arrival, porters shouting, passengers gathering their bags, steam hissing white across the boards. "Now, Silas!" Pearl shouted, and the young man bolted for the nearest passenger car, satchel clutched tight, while Timothy swung the canvas sack of ballots off Pearl's saddle and followed hard on his heels. One of Dunmore's men lunged to intercept, grabbing for Timothy's arm, and Timothy, who had spent a lifetime swinging a heavy hammer at a forge and had muscle to show for it, simply turned into the grab and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him staggering back into a stack of freight crates to a chorus of startled shouts from the crowd. "Stop them!" Dunmore's voice cracked for the first time, all smoothness gone, pure naked fury underneath. "Do not let that train leave with that box." But it was too late. The town marshal, a wiry, no-nonsense man named Grady who had heard the commotion, was already pushing through the crowd with his hand on his revolver, and the conductor, sensing trouble on his platform, was shouting for order in a voice that carried like a foghorn. Silas Cobb was up the steps and into the passenger car, and Timothy handed the canvas sack up after him, before turning to plant himself squarely in the path of the second of Dunmore's men who had tried to follow. Pearl, watching the chaos with her heart in her throat, saw Dunmore himself start forward, his composure finally, completely gone, reaching inside his fine gray coat, and she did the only thing left to do. She stepped directly into his path, small and immovable, her chin lifted, and said, loud enough for every soul on that platform to hear, "Cyrus Dunmore, if you draw a weapon on this platform in front of these witnesses, you will hang for it, and you know it. It is over. The evidence is on that train, the marshal is standing not 10 feet from you, and half of Huntington just watched your men attack a blacksmith in broad daylight. Whatever you are about to do, think very hard about how it looks to every single person watching." For a long, terrible moment, Dunmore stood frozen, his hand still inside his coat, his eyes locked on Pearl's, calculating, furious, and then Marshal Grady's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Dunmore, I would be obliged if you took your hand out of that coat nice and slow, and then you and I are going to have a conversation about why your men just assaulted a citizen on my platform." Dunmore's hand came out empty. Whatever fight had been left in him drained away all at once, replaced by the cold calculation of a man doing rapid arithmetic on his own chances, and finding them suddenly, catastrophically poor. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, but his voice had lost all its former smoothness, and nobody on that platform was inclined to believe him. The train's whistle blew, long and shrill, and began to pull away from the platform, carrying Sela's cob and the true ballot box and Dunmore's own damning ledger toward the county seat and Judge Whitfield's waiting jurisdiction. And Cyrus Dunmore stood on the platform at Huntington, surrounded by a crowd of witnesses and a marshal with a great many questions, and watched his entire scheme disappear down the tracks in a plume of steam. It took the better part of the next 2 days for the full reckoning to unfold, but unfold it did, thoroughly and completely. Judge Whitfield, upon receiving Sela's Cobb's testimony, Dunmore's own ledger, and the recovered ballot box, ordered the Sagebrush precinct returns counted at once, and wired federal marshals with jurisdiction over election fraud to take formal statements. Otis Kane, faced with a ledger entry in his own name and the prospect of a long prison term, confirmed everything Sela's had said within an hour of being questioned, and Frank Delacourt, the third rider, was found 2 days later trying to catch a stage out of the territory and arrested before he made it 50 miles. Cyrus Dunmore himself was arrested at his own home in Journey's End 3 days after the confrontation at Huntington, charged with conspiracy, election fraud, and assault, his fine gray coat looking considerably less impressive as Marshal Grady and Sheriff Reese walked him out to a waiting wagon in front of a crowd of townspeople who had gathered, drawn by word that finally, after years of quiet, unprovable dealing, the man who had tried to steal their crossing and their county was going to answer for it. Horace Bell withdrew his candidacy the same day, and when the corrected count of the Sagebrush precinct was added to the tally 2 weeks later, Judge Whitfield was re-elected county commissioner by a wide and entirely uncontested margin, with his very first act in office being the formal, permanent rejection of any bridge charter or water rights claim on the Awahi crossing, a decision that left the ford at Wells Ranch exactly as it had always been, a free and open crossing for every wagon, drover, and traveler who needed it. Pearl Wells stood on the porch of her ranch house the evening the news came in, reading the wire Sheriff Reese had sent out with a rider special for her benefit, and felt something in her chest finally, fully unclench for the first time in a week. It was Timothy who found her there, having ridden out the moment he closed the forge, still in his work clothes, stood on his forearms, Duke, fully healed now, moving easy and sound beneath him. "I heard," he said, dismounting. "The whole town has heard." Whitfield rejected the bridge charter outright. He did. Pearl's voice was thick with something that was equal parts relief and disbelief. "It is over, Timothy. The ranch is safe. The crossing is safe. My father's whole life's work safe." "You did that," Timothy said quietly, coming to stand beside her on the porch steps. "You, not luck, not chance. You rode into that canyon and blew a cow horn at armed men, and you stood in front of Cyrus Dunmore on a crowded platform and stared him down until a marshal could get to him. I have known a great many brave people in my life, Pearl Wells, and I have never known one braver than you." Pearl looked at him in the fading evening light, at the steady, quiet strength that had never once wavered through the whole terrible, breathless week, at the man who had ridden 4 miles in the dark on a wounded horse, because he could not stand the thought of her facing danger alone, who had thrown himself into a river to save strangers before he had even known the ambush was aimed at more than robbery, who had stood between her and armed men without a moment's hesitation. And she felt the last of her careful caution simply fall away. "I could not have done any of it without you," she said. "The stallion, the canyon, the platform, all of it. You were there every single time, Timothy, and I do not think that was luck either." "No," Timothy agreed softly. "I do not suppose it was." Pearl stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the healing scrape along his jaw from where Dunmore's man had grabbed him on the platform, and she thought of 10 years of quiet distance between them, 10 years of not saying the things that mattered, and decided, standing there in the gold evening light with her whole world finally safe, that she was done waiting for someone else to make the first move. "Timothy Haskins," she said, her voice steady even though her heart was racing, "I have been thinking, since the night you came riding up my ridge road with nothing but a blacksmith's hammer to defend me, that I have wasted an unforgivable amount of time being careful about this." "About what?" Timothy asked, though something in his eyes said he already knew. "About this," Pearl said, and closed the last of the distance between them, rising up on her toes to press her lips to his, gentle and certain, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering just as hard as her own. For one startled second Timothy went still, and then his arms came around her, careful and sure, one hand rising to cup her jaw as he kissed her back with all the quiet, patient devotion of a man who had waited 10 years without ever quite admitting to himself what he was waiting for. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Timothy rested his forehead against hers, a slow smile breaking across his face. "I have been wanting to do that since the day I pulled a man out of a wrecked coach and looked up to see you doing the exact same thing on the other side," he admitted. "I just did not think a woman as capable and stubborn and wonderful as you would ever want a plain blacksmith with soot under his nails and nothing much to offer but a forge and a small string of horses." "Timothy," Pearl said, laughing softly even as her eyes went bright, "you rode straight into gunfire to defend my ranch. You saved Silas Cobb's life and mine on that platform, and you have the gentlest hands I have ever seen on a frightened horse. I have loved a great many things about you since I was 7 years old and did not have the sense to know what I was feeling. I am not interested in what you have to offer. I am interested in you." They stood together on the porch as the sun finished setting behind the western ridge, painting the sky in long streaks of amber and rose, Duke grazing contentedly in the yard behind them. And for a long while neither of them said anything more, content simply to stand in the quiet together. Two people who had spent a very dangerous week, discovering that the safest place either of them had ever stood was in each other's arms. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace to Journey's End that the town had not known in years. Cyrus Dunmore was convicted at the county seat on charges of election fraud and conspiracy, and sentenced to a term at the territorial prison, his fine house and land sold at auction to settle his debts, much of it purchased at fair price by honest ranchers who had spent years being squeezed by his schemes. Otis Kane and Frank Delacourt received shorter sentences in exchange for their testimony, and Silas Cobb, whose conscience had ultimately saved the county's election and very likely several lives besides, was given a full pardon by Judge Whitfield for his part in the ambush, on account of his crucial and courageous testimony, and went on to take honest work at the very stage relay station he had once helped rob. Determined, he told anyone who would listen, to spend the rest of his life making up for one bad week. Pearl Wells returned to the quiet, steady work of running her father's ranch and tending to the animals of half the county, her reputation as a frontier veterinarian only strengthened by the story of how she had saved a rancher's prize stallion in the middle of a river ambush, a tale that traveled up and down the Awahi Valley and brought her more calls for her services than she could easily keep up with alone. Timothy Haskins kept the forge running, the steady ring of his hammer against iron, once again the reassuring heartbeat of a town that depended on him for wagon wheels and horseshoes and plow blades. And more than once in the weeks that followed, Pearl found herself riding into town not for any veterinary business at all, but simply for the pleasure of watching him work. Of the way he would look up from the anvil the moment her mare came into view and smile like the sun had just come up twice in one day. It was Pearl, in the end, who asked him to stay for good, on a warm evening in late summer when the two of them sat together on the porch of the Wells ranch house, Duke and Pearl's mare grazing side by side in the corral, as though they too had reached some quiet understanding. "I have been thinking," she said, "that a ranch this size is a great deal of work for one woman and one aging ranch hand, and that a forge does not need to sit in the middle of town if a man is willing to build one closer to home." Timothy looked over at her, understanding dawning slow and warm across his face. "Are you asking me to move my whole livelihood 4 miles out of Journey's End, Pearl Wells?" "I am asking you," Pearl said, taking his hand in both of hers, "to build your life next to mine, however you want to arrange the particulars. I do not need a husband to run this ranch, Timothy. I have proven I can do that myself. But I find I do not want to run it without you beside me, not because I need you there, but because I want you there every single day for the rest of my life." Timothy raised her hand to his lips, his eyes bright with something that looked very much like the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask for 10 long years. "Then I accept," he said, "on one condition." "What condition is that?" "That you marry me first, so that when Caleb Bishop tells the whole valley I have moved in with the prettiest, most stubborn horse doctor in Baker County, nobody has cause to raise an eyebrow about it." Pearl laughed, bright and full, the sound carrying out across the ranch yard into the warm evening air, and leaned in to kiss him again, slow and certain this time, with none of the caution that had held them both back for so many years. "Yes," she said, against his mouth. "Yes, Timothy Haskins. 1,000 times yes." They were married that October, in a simple ceremony on the porch of the Wells ranch house with the whole of Journey's End in attendance, Sheriff Reese standing witness alongside Caleb Bishop, Alonzo Prout clapping enthusiastically with his once broken arm now fully healed, and Silas Cobb, cleaned up and steady-eyed, presenting them with a small, carefully forged horseshoe that Timothy himself recognized instantly as his own work, one of the shoes he had made for Duke in the days after the ambush. Kept and polished and offered now as a wedding gift, and a quiet symbol of gratitude neither of them would ever forget. Timothy built his new forge on a rise overlooking the Awahi crossing within sight of the ranch house, close enough that Pearl could watch the glow of his fire from her porch on winter evenings, and far enough from town that the ring of his hammer became, for both of them, simply the sound of home. Pearl's veterinary practice grew steadily, her skill and her courage both now the stuff of local legend, and more than one young girl in Journey's End, watching her ride out on some urgent call with her satchel and her steady hands, began to think that perhaps doctoring animals for a living was not so strange an ambition after all. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done, Pearl and Timothy would often walk down together to the crossing itself, to the ford that had very nearly cost them everything and had instead given them each other, and stand watching the Awahi River run steady and free beneath the wide Oregon sky, exactly as it always had, exactly as Pearl's father had always intended it should. "To think," Pearl said once, leaning into Timothy's side as the last light faded gold across the water, "it took a stagecoach wreck and a stolen election, and a wounded horse to make either one of us brave enough to say what we should have said years ago. "I do not regret the wait," Timothy said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think some things only mean what they are supposed to mean once you have fought hard enough to keep them. And Pearl Wells, I would fight that whole week over again twice for this." Pearl smiled up at him, the crossing water catching the last of the light behind them, and thought that whatever else the wild country had taken from her over the years, it had given her back something far greater in return. A home built on chosen ground, a partnership built on equal strength, and a love that had waited patiently through 10 quiet years and 1 dangerous week to finally, fully arrive. They stood together at the crossing until the stars came out, 2 people who had once been children walking home from school together, now bound to each other and to the land they had both fought to save, with nothing left unsaid between them, and nothing ahead of them but the steady, ordinary, extraordinary work of a shared life, well and truly begun.